Rain is hitting concrete somewhere in rural Georgia, and inside a curved gray room the size of a walk-in closet, Linda is listening to it land. Not the way rain sounds on a tin roof, sharp and rattling. Not the way it sounds through a tent, close and threatening. This is different, duller, rounder, like the rain is happening to someone else, somewhere far away, and she is simply allowed to overhear it. She pulls the blanket up, checks that the small steel key is still looped through the string beside her pillow, and closes her eyes again. 4 years ago, Linda slept in a car with the windows cracked so she wouldn't suffocate on a bad night. Tonight, she is asleep inside a piece of highway drainage pipe. The exact kind a state transportation department orders by the truckload to run water under a road. Nobody built this pipe to be a bedroom. That's exactly why it works. Here's what almost nobody guesses correctly on the first try. This entire home, walls, floor, door, lock, cost less than most people spend fixing a used car. And the concrete, the thing that makes this story sound strange enough to click on, is the least interesting part of it, according to almost everyone who has actually slept inside one. So what is the interesting part? Stick with me, because the answer isn't really about concrete at all. It's about what happens to a person's body and mind after their first full night of uninterrupted sleep in years. And that story starts somewhere you wouldn't expect. It starts with a phone call nobody wants to make. A construction foreman in one town, a church volunteer coordinator in another, both hearing some version of the same sentence. We ordered the wrong size. Highway drainage pipe gets cast in exact, specific dimensions for exact, specific projects. When a job gets rerouted, downsized, or canceled, the pipe doesn't get a refund. It gets stacked in a yard, taking up space a manufacturer would rather use for something that will actually sell. That's the gap a scattered handful of groups who had never coordinated with each other quietly started stepping into. Outside Macon, Georgia, a small congregation with a gravel lot behind their fellowship hall started with a single unit, built mostly by retirees who'd spent their working lives in construction and hadn't touched a drill in years. In the Texas Hill Country, a veterans support group took on a donated pipe section specifically for a former Army mechanic who'd been sleeping in his truck outside the VA clinic because he refused a shelter bed but wouldn't turn down help from people who'd served too. In rural Ohio, a volunteer crew working out of a hardware store's back lot built 3 units in a single spring, one of them for a woman who'd been living behind the same store for over a year, close enough that the owner already knew her name. None of these groups had a shared blueprint or a national campaign behind them. Each one arrived at roughly the same idea independently because the math is nearly impossible to avoid once you're standing next to unwanted pipe and a person with nowhere to sleep. The pitch to a manufacturer sitting on rejected pipe is almost embarrassingly simple. You're going to pay to move this or bury it anyway. Donate it instead, and we'll turn it into a home for someone who currently has none. Most of what happens next takes a single Saturday. A flatbed truck arrives before sunrise. A crane operator, usually volunteering the equipment for free, sets the pipe onto a gravel pad before the coffee's even finished brewing. By mid-morning, someone's grandfather, who spent 30 years as an electrician, is on his knees running a single wire for 1 outlet and 1 light, while 2 teenagers who've never held a drill before today are screwing down a raised plywood floor. By evening, there's a bed frame, a smoke detector, a hook screwed into the wall by the door, and almost always, a handwritten note left taped inside from whoever built it. Nobody plans that part. It just seems to happen every time, in every town, like it's less a decision and more an instinct. The hardest part of building any house, the actual structural shell strong enough to survive decades of weather, arrives already finished. These volunteers aren't builders. They're just moving furniture into something a highway engineer already designed to outlast most of the buildings in town. So what does an actual day look like from inside the pipe? Not the summary version, the real one. Morning arrives without an alarm because there's no window to let daylight creep in gradually and ease you awake. There's one way in, a steel door, and when it's shut, the inside stays dim until you open it. Residents describe waking up disoriented for the first few weeks, reaching for a light switch on a wall that doesn't have a corner to put one on. The first motion of the day is almost always the same. Feet on the plywood floor, testing the temperature before committing to standing up. Because concrete doesn't warm up the moment the sun rises, it runs on its own schedule, hours behind the actual weather outside. Linda keeps a pair of thick socks hanging on that hook by the door, specifically for this moment. Small routine. Repeated every single morning the way someone might automatically reach for coffee before they're even fully awake. Then there's the ceiling. Or rather, the curve where a ceiling should be. You can stand fully upright, only down the center strip of the floor, maybe 3 feet wide. Every resident learns this within the first day, usually the hard way. Forehead first, in the dark, reaching for something on a shelf that was never quite level to begin with, because nothing about a pipe agrees to sit flat. Tape won't hold on a curve. A calendar peels off the wall by Wednesday. A picture frame sits crooked no matter how carefully you hang it. You stop fighting the shape after a while and just live inside it, the same way you'd learn the creak in an old staircase and simply step around it without thinking. Rain is where the pipe genuinely surprises people. Above ground, rain announces itself immediately, loud on a roof, sharp on a windshield. Through 8 inches of solid concrete, it arrives muffled and strange, less like weather and more like a memory of weather. Some residents say they've grown to actually like storms now, because a hard rain outside means an unusually quiet, cocooned night inside. Linda says the first thunderstorm after she moved in, she sat up just to listen to it properly, the way some people listen to a song they haven't heard in years. Heat works on its own delayed clock entirely. Concrete absorbs warmth all day long and then slowly releases it hours later, which means the inside of a pipe is often at its warmest right around midnight, long after the sun outside has gone down, and at its coldest well into mid-morning, long after everyone else has already warmed up. Residents learn to dress for the concrete schedule instead of the skies. In humid stretches of the country, a small dehumidifier hums quietly in the corner of nearly every occupied unit because that cool concrete never quite feels fully dry, no matter the season. In the Texas unit, the veteran who lives there keeps his dehumidifier running on a timer, his old mechanic instincts rigged up himself, because he says he'd rather fix a problem before it starts than deal with it after. And then there's the silence, which is the detail almost every single resident brings up unprompted. 8 inches of concrete does to sound roughly what a heavy blackout curtain does to light. Traffic outside, an argument 2 lots over, footsteps on gravel, all of it simply stops at the wall. Several residents describe the exact same strange first night, lying awake, not because of any noise, but because of how completely absent it is. After years of sleeping with one ear listening for trouble, that kind of silence can feel almost unsettling, like waiting for a shoe to drop that never does. A few crack the door open on purpose, just an inch, to let a sliver of the outside world back in. Because total silence, it turns out, takes some getting used to. The same way a person used to a noisy house can't sleep in one that's too quiet. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If the walls are this thick and the door locks from the inside, does that mean people out here are more alone than they were before? Ask Linda, and she'll tell you the opposite happened. There's no bathroom and no kitchen inside the pipe itself, which sounds like a limitation. And it is one, but it also does something nobody quite plans for. It forces a walk outside every single day to the shared washroom, the communal water spigot, the small covered area where residents cook on shared burners. And that short daily walk turns into the same handful of conversations over and over. Someone asking how another resident's knee is holding up. Someone sharing coffee they didn't need all of. The retired electrician who wired Linda's unit still stops by most weekends, not because anyone's asking him to, but because he says he likes checking on his own work and checking on her, without saying that second part out loud. In the Ohio cluster of 3 units, the woman who used to live behind the hardware store now keeps a small shared garden bed between the pipes, and the other 2 residents have started weeding it without being asked, the way neighbors do when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score. It's a strange kind of community that builds itself entirely out of necessity, the same way it apparently did generations ago in mountain towns that had nothing but each other either. Loneliness doesn't disappear. Residents will tell you that honestly. Some nights, especially the first ones, it's louder than the silence around it. But it's a different kind of loneliness than the kind that comes from sleeping somewhere unsafe. It's the ordinary kind. The kind a person can actually rest inside of, instead of the kind that keeps a body on alert until sunrise. And that difference, according to almost everyone who works with these programs, is the entire point. Caseworkers who've spent years around programs like this keep describing the same 3 shifts, and none of them have anything to do with the concrete. The first is sleep, the real kind, not the shallow, half-alert version that happens outside. Linda says it took her almost 3 weeks before her shoulders finally dropped from somewhere up near her ears. A tension she says she'd genuinely stopped noticing because it had simply become normal. A rested person, it turns out, shows up differently. To a job interview, to a doctor's appointment, to a phone call with a daughter she'd been putting off for a year because she didn't know what to say yet. The second is the address itself. You cannot open a bank account, apply for a job, or receive a piece of government mail without one, and a shelter cot has never counted as one. A numbered unit on a registered lot with an actual mailbox out front does. For Linda, that mailbox meant a job application finally went somewhere instead of nowhere. For the veteran in Texas, it meant a disability claim that had been stalled for months finally had somewhere to send its paperwork. And the third is smaller than you'd expect, and somehow the one people mention with the most emotion. It's the key. More than one caseworker has described a new resident wearing their very first house key in years on a shoelace around their neck, checking for it constantly, almost compulsively, the way most of us check for a phone. A key means exactly one person decides who walks through that door. After years of being moved along, told where to be and when, that's not a small convenience. It's a repair. While small projects like this were spreading quietly through towns that had never coordinated with each other, the picture of who actually needs this kind of housing was shifting underneath everyone. The fastest growing group of homeless Americans right now isn't who most people imagine. It's people over 55. Some caseworkers have started calling it the gray wave. Renters priced out of apartments they'd kept spotless for 2 decades. A woman who lost half her household income the same week she buried her husband. A warehouse worker whose knees gave out 3 years before any pension could catch up to him. Many of these people have never so much as gotten a parking ticket. Their grandmothers keeping themselves presentable in a gas station bathroom so their grandchildren never find out. Grandfathers sleeping upright in the front seat of a truck they can no longer afford to register. For a lot of this generation, a loud, crowded emergency shelter feels more frightening than the truck does. But a small, locked private home on a quiet lot, next to neighbors closer to their own age, is often the one kind of help they're actually willing to accept. People who run these small programs say something happens when older residents move in. They change the whole feel of the place because they bring something no funding program can supply: decades of simply knowing how to be a good neighbor. In the Ohio cluster, the newest resident is 68, a former school cafeteria worker who lost her apartment when her building was sold and converted into short-term rentals. She didn't ask for much when she moved in. Just a small shelf for a photo of her late husband, and somewhere quiet enough to hear herself think again. Within a month, she'd started leaving a thermos of coffee out for whoever helped with the Saturday builds, whether she knew them or not. Nobody organized that. She just decided it was something a good neighbor would do, and did it. It would be dishonest to tell this story without sitting with the pushback, because some of it is completely fair. Critics don't need a long argument. They say it plainly. We're housing people in drainage pipes. 100 square feet leaves almost no room to fully recover from a bad day, and some residents genuinely do try it, last a few weeks, and go back outside, because even a solid wall can start to feel like it's closing in after enough years of not trusting walls at all. And there's a sharper worry underneath all of it, that every cheap pipe home gives a city one more excuse to keep avoiding the much harder, much more expensive job of building the real housing it actually owes people. That argument boils down to this: a pipe is a tourniquet, not a cure. And that's true. It's also incomplete, because the people making that argument in a council meeting are almost never the ones bleeding tonight. The volunteers building these homes are making a simple, almost blunt bet. $2,500 and a locked door right now beats a perfect plan 5 years from now. You don't have to think that settles the whole housing debate in this country. You only have to admit the debate has been running for decades, and the pipe took one Saturday. Back to that rainy night in Georgia. Linda isn't thinking about concrete specifications or housing policy or the cost per unit compared to a government program. She's thinking about the fact that tomorrow, for the first time in longer than she wants to admit, she has somewhere specific to be. A shift at a diner 2 towns over that hired her because she finally had an address to put on the application. She's already decided what socks she'll wear. She already knows which floorboard creaks near the door. She knows the concrete will still be warm from the day when she gets up, and cold again by the time she leaves for her shift. Small facts. The kind of facts a person only accumulates about a place they actually live, not a place they're just passing through. Here's the detail worth carrying out of this longer than any statistic. Every other cheap shelter people have tried: tents, plywood lean-tos, tarp-covered frames, eventually tears, rots, or blows apart in a bad season. A drainage pipe is engineered to hold back the weight of the earth under a highway for 100 years. Long after the council meetings arguing about zoning have been forgotten. Long after this particular news cycle has moved on to something else entirely, that pipe will still be sitting exactly where the volunteers set it down, with someone still asleep inside it. The arguments about whether this is enough have a lifespan. The concrete does not. What started as a mistake, a piece of highway drainage pipe cast in the wrong size and left to sit in a construction yard, became something almost nobody who poured that concrete could have predicted. A locked door, a fixed address, one full, uninterrupted night of sleep for someone who had gone without all three for far too long. Not because the pipe itself is remarkable. It isn't. It's just concrete, but because of what a key on a shoelace can quietly repair in a person, one ordinary night at a time. If this shifted how you think about what a home actually needs to be, let me know in the comments which part surprised you most. And if you want more stories about the quiet, overlooked ways ordinary Americans are solving problems the rest of the country has stopped trying to fix, stick around. There's more of this coming.